Hey,
Hello.
hey, Josh, how are you?
I'm great, Paul. How are you today?
Oh, just great. Thanks for asking. Thanks for asking. So welcome everybody. We're excited. As you all know, Josh Herman is here with us today to be part of our ZBrush Masters. So he's going to be kicking off our season 4, which we're going to have Josh Herman, we're going to have Steve Lord, then Hossein Diba, Raphael Grassetti, and Maria Pamfilova. So a very great lineup for season 4. Really excited about this. And again, for those of you that are just joining us for the first time ever, these are special streams that we do with some very talented and amazing artists from different backgrounds, different industries. They're called ZBrush Masters. We will be with them along their journey as they show you guys how they work with inside of ZBrush. So Josh has worked on several films, pretty much all the Marvels, right? Pretty much.
A lot of them, yeah.
A lot of them.
A lot of
like,
them. Yeah.
You did the Iron Man for Iron Man 2?
A lot of Iron Man. 2, not 2. I didn't do 1 or 2. I did a lot of the suits basically from Avengers 1 to some of the ones that were kind of getting to like Age of Ultron. I didn't do the nano suit at the end, so I did kind of like a middle block. At the end of my time at Marvel, I ended up doing about 13 different versions of Iron Man, between Iron Man, Rhodey, Hulkbusters, different variants of that.
Right. So it's safe to say Josh has worked on some cool stuff here, people. So he's a very talented artist, great concept artist. So he's going to be showing us some really unique ways of using ZBrush. So you'll want to tune in for these. It's called ZBrush Masters again. We do them every Tuesday. The time's not going to be the same because depending on people where they are in the world, we have different times. So make sure you check out our schedule. I will put the schedule link in the chat. So what we'll be doing here is I'll be quiet here soon, and Josh will be taking over, but I will be monitoring the chat for questions that you guys will have. I will throw them to Josh where I can. Of course, he'll be talking about certain subjects, so I'll try and find spots to throw your questions in that make sense for where he's at within his presentation. So I appreciate you all for coming and being part of this. Afternoon, Ashley. Nice to see you. So Josh is part of the Gnomon team now. And see, he's the chief creative officer. But like I mentioned, he's worked on many, many, many films. I'm going to let him go through this and talk about where he's been and what he's done. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Josh Herman.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so right now, like you're saying, I kind of put this little, I guess I'm trying to figure out which way I'm looking. There we go. This thing here for you guys to get today, so we can kind of talk a little bit through my process, a little bit of my history, to kind of give some context into what I'll show today. So these are some of the titles that you see that I've held: character artist, concept artist, creature designer, character designer, art director, creative director, and then currently at Gnomon, I'm the chief creative officer. So I've worked on a bunch of different films. To kind of jump back at the beginning of this to talk a little bit about who I am. I'm actually a Gnomon alumni, and that's part of the reason I ended up going back to work with the Gnomon team, is because it's a place where I kind of found my start. So I ended up going to Gnomon about 10 years ago and graduating in 2009. And then one of my first jobs, actually right when I got out, I was graduating Gnomon, and if you know anything about Gnomon, this is the old logo here intentionally, but it's the School of Visual Effects. So I was graduating expecting to work in post, work at ILM, some big VFX house or something like that. But I had started doing some portfolio pieces in my last term, and this was one of the ones that I ended up doing, and this was a robot, obviously. And so it was based off of a sketch by Kang Lee, and I ended up doing some tours of studios around the LA area, and one of the ones that I kind of did an impromptu tour and sort of had an impromptu portfolio review was Legacy Effects. And so Legacy Effects, if you don't know anything about Legacy Effects, is formerly known as Stan Winston Studios. If you don't know anything about Stan Winston Studios, you should do some research, because it's like one of the most, I guess, it has such a crazy history of doing all these really beautiful films and practical effects work. But it coming out of Gnomon, where I thought I was going to be doing mostly CG and post, I ended up being in pre-production and working at a practical effects house, which is a very different mindset for me. And I think that that first job that I got there really kind of started to change the way that I look at things, because I don't look at things as for like from a VFX angle, but I look at it a lot of ways in what's kind of now called like visual development. So if you're in animation groups, or if you know about the Marvel team, they do visual development, which is basically trying to get the final result as fast as possible, so you can iterate through what that's going to be on screen. So Legacy, it did, or Stan Winston did all these 4 films here: Jurassic Park, Predator, Terminator, and Aliens. But they started getting really into 3D printing when Stan had passed. And actually, one of the biggest movies they started doing 3D printing on was Iron Man. And they started doing a lot of costumes for that. But what I ended up doing was I came on, and you can kind of see from my previous portfolio here when I was getting hired what the job I was going to work on, and this was for Real Steel. And so they had me start doing these models and sculpts for the Real Steel movie. This is Noisy Boy, and if anybody's ever watched the movie, I ended up watching it a couple weeks ago. I actually like it. At first, I thought it was going to be not a great movie when I was working on it, but I actually quite like it now. So I worked on these models and kind of starting to get into 3D printing, getting into rapid prototyping. And these models are not small. These are animatronics that were supposed to be, or were, 8 feet tall, 9 feet tall. So they were filled with, I was working with mechanical teams to understand how they're going to put hydraulics in, how they were going to puppeteer it. Just a very different workflow than what I had done earlier. And what I noticed when working with them again is that they really wanted to see what the final product could look like, even if it was a rough sketch, or if it was just something to get eyes on how they would work on their part of it. So we worked back and forth quite a bit. A lot of 3D printing for commercials as well. So you'll see like making assets for commercials, helmets and things for the Halo commercials. And at this time, Legacy was really starting to pioneer a lot of 3D concepting for film as well. And so they were doing some of the creatures and the robots you see on the right. They had kind of found that since they were a practical effects company, that what they needed to do was get into 3D as fast as possible. And the traditional pipeline of going a 2D sketch to a 3D model, getting your approvals, and then outputting that for print was a much slower process. Whereas if they could just sculpt traditionally or digitally and present that to clients or directors, they could kind of skip the 2D step. And so I started getting into this very early, and you can see some of my earlier sketches and stuff here and concepts that were used. To full disclosure, not a lot of my stuff got picked then, right? It was kind of me starting to get into concept art. I was also working with some super talented artists in Ian Joyner and Darnell Isom and Scott Patton, who, for me being just fresh out of the industry, I shouldn't have been getting my stuff picked. They're much better than me. So I ended up kind of getting into that concept world there and starting to learn that the faster I could iterate, the faster I could show the final product, the more I could do. And the quicker we could work on timelines. So some more projects you're going to see here: Total Recall, a lot of stuff, again, working with suits and people in suits. So anything that was kind of the mechanics here was actually worn by an actor, and that would be green screen and replaced. And then eventually they started rekindling or working back up their relationship with Marvel on the Avengers. And so I got the chance to work with Ryan Meinerding and Charlie Wynn on the Avengers and create this Hulk maquette for when they were redesigning Hulk, which is a great experience. Got to meet Mark Ruffalo, do scans of his face and his teeth so we could try to put those in the character, right? Really cool experience to do this, but also work in, again, rapid prototyping. So we would take these and we would print them and present them to Joss Whedon or present them to people to get the final approval. And then eventually this one actually got turned into a sideshow statue, which I have somewhere over in my house.
Like,
yeah, it's a pretty beefy one. It's tall.
24 inches, isn't it? Like 20 inches or something like that?
It's at least 20, yeah.
Yeah.
With real pants, not these sculpted pants, which is pretty awesome. And then continuing on that project, I got to work on the Mark 7 Iron Man. And if you don't know all the marks, that's okay. Most people don't. But this is basically the one where when Tony's is having a conversation with Loki and he gets chucked out of the building and he kind of falls, that's this suit. So I got to work on this one. And similar, you'll see is more 3D printing and rapid prototyping stuff. So this is some of the work in progress as they were painting and getting things ready to be gold plated. And some kind of moody shots of the actual print itself. And so after I worked there for about 1.5 years, I ended up deciding that I wanted to get back into games or get into games, because it was kind of, I'm a big gamer, I love games, and so I wanted to transition, and I ended up getting into Naughty Dog, working on Uncharted 3. I don't have a lot of stuff to show from Uncharted 3, but this will kind of show you a little bit of my back and forth in my career, starting expecting to work in post, ending up working in pre and practical, then jumping into games, working at Naughty Dog. I got to work on a cinematic character here, which is Salim, if anybody's played Uncharted 3, and then a lot of the background characters. And at that point, I was starting to understand sort of how a game engine works, how games work, how you can customize characters, and I kind of became in charge of how you could swap different pieces on a character, right? How you could make so all the pants fit with all the legs, and the boots with the shirts, and all that kind of stuff. And so I got really interested in that. But as I was ending my time at Naughty Dog, I kind of got they approached me to say, do I want to work with them on The Last of Us, which was at the time untitled, or should I also at the same time got a call from Marvel Studios, who had said, like, hey, we really are interested in you working with us on like full time on this upcoming movie Iron Man 3. So I ended up working there for about 5 years, and this is a pretty good spread of the titles that I ended up working on heavily. I did end up leaving right before Endgame. Some of my work transitioned into Endgame because at first they were actually one movie, so it's kind of a weird titling there. But I basically started on as a contract employee in Iron Man 3, and through my work there, found a whole different range of things that I could do, from rapid prototype stuff, model stuff, concept sculpting stuff. So here's a little bit of a range of that, and then we'll jump into some stuff soon. Iron Man 3, so I ended up starting to work on the Mark 42, which is basically the gold suit, and then also working on War Machine, who ended up getting repainted to be red, white, and blue to be Iron Patriot. Some more close-up shots as this. And what we would do with these models is we would hand them off to the visual effects companies. None of my models were used, as far as I know, as the final models. And that's kind of something I like to bring up, because for me, what we were doing here in visual development was to create a visual bar that could be handed off. It wasn't necessarily to create the final model. So again, trying to get to the end result as fast as possible so that it can be approved, art directed, and sent down the pipeline. Some more characters that you kind of see, and a lot of this stuff was rapid prototypes. This was some paint over by Charlie Wynn, but coming up with the final, finding the final characters and a lot of this stuff for Star-Lord, background concept and Alien. So you'll see some of these characters walking around in Guardians of the Galaxy or Thor or different types of things. And then getting into some more concept work, and one of the biggest things that I got kind of lucky, I think, I was working with on Guardians of the Galaxy was being able to design Groot, which was a really awesome experience for the first film. So you can kind of see my early concept work that we ended up getting notes on, iterating, getting some feedback, and kind of resulting in the final version that gets sent off to visual effects to make work, right?
How many iterations do you think you went through for Groot?
I think I probably went through about 10 iterations on Groot from the very beginning. That model started as a very we had started on Guardians before there was anybody on it. It was a script, and there was no James Gunn, no Chris Pratt, no Vin Diesel, no anybody on the film. And so everybody in the art department and the visual development department, they basically said, hey, like, can you do some pitch art for us on what you think these characters could look like? And me kind of being the 3D person, I just chose Groot as like the only one. It kind of fit my skill set the most, right? Rather than trying to compete with Ryan Meinerding in costume design, I figured I would play to my strengths and make a character. So I made a version of Groot that was somewhat similar-ish to this. That didn't have the hair, was kind of tall, lanky, very tree, but trying not to be tree beard, right? And ended up coming back when James Gunn was was hired on the film, he came back and was like, hey, you know, here's the ones that I liked. And he happened to pick one of my pitch art ones. And so he had basically given notes on that. And this was the first notes based on the initial sketch. And then I just went from there.
I think it's amazing. Vin Diesel is Groot and Iron Man. What are those sound tests coming? Okay, come in and just say one word for me.
Yeah. Pretty good.
He's got a stranglehold on that market now.
Yeah, right. The voice.
Yeah, the voice of just Groot.
So yeah, we continued on this. There's a ton of different things in here, but you'll see, you know, my stuff really ranges from concepts, creatures to kind of, you know, more precise models like this for Iron Man, for Ultron, for getting into concept work, getting into kind of a range of different things where we're trying to present options that are relatively final looking, but as fast as possible. So on the left, you'll see like a concept piece that I did for Ultron. Charlie Wynn ended up designing the final version of Ultron. And so my job on that film was to do some concept work early and then to come in later and do a more final model. Versions of Hulkbuster, again, for Age of Ultron. More concept work here for potential versions of Baby Groot for Guardians 2. And then we ended up getting a call to work on Spider-Man for Civil War, which this suit was the suit that Ryan designed and I sculpted out so it could be created as a costume for Civil War. It did end up getting changed. So if you're a big fan, you'll notice that it actually has different design lines. But this was the one that was made and worn on set. So I guess I have that little. It's like exclusive at this point now. Close-ups of the mask, and all this is made in ZBrush, and then. This was a couple years ago, so using the Keyshot bridge to bring it over to Keyshot to do renders and maybe do some material work in there. Also getting into some more of my personal work, and this is stuff that my personal work often is the exact opposite of what I'm working on in production. So if I'm working on a lot of robots, if I'm working on Iron Man, if I'm working on Ultron, all that kind of stuff, I'm going to go home and want to do creatures. If I'm working on Hulk and Groot and stuff like that, you'll see that I'll want to work on robots again. It's kind of this opposite thing because I like both of them quite a bit. So I kind of bounce back and forth. And so this was about 8 or so years ago. I was working on a book for Ballistic called Essence Creatures. So just kind of doing some explorations at this point and really just trying things out. Trying to get into more of an illustrative sense at this point. One of the things that, especially as I look back on my career, my portfolio, not having enough story in my portfolio is something that I've slowly been working on. So getting into kind of the illustrative sense of that. And then again, more personal work. So at this time I was probably working on a creature, and that's why this is the one that I chose. But doing a redesign of Silver Surfer. And I was also taking a lot of what I've been learning at the time and putting it into this piece. So this is very Ultron, very Iron Man, very, the things I had already been working on, probably around late of Iron Man 3. But a lot of ZBrush work here for sure, to explore, find shapes, find all this stuff, and really kind of find the character. But giving myself design challenges is something I like to do to see if I can solve them in a way, kind of like a puzzle. More design work for different types of creatures and characters, trying to get more story into some of my designs, but playing with different types of renders on certain characters, right? So doing a more darkened, and also 3 different types of renders here. So on the left, you'll see this is a Photoshop paint over of ZBrush renders using some ZBrush shaders to create a comic book look, to explore that, and then to do a kind of a Keyshot render on the right side with the bridge that gives, a nicer look. But for me, I actually prefer the ones on the left because it kind of gives me more sense to play with the story. And then getting into some more personal work here as well, where I'm trying to get into more story and build out to be more of a cinematic portfolio. So one of the things before we kind of jump forward is to give you a little sense of my mindset. I kind of entered the industry as a modeler and then slowly transitioned to a designer. And I've kind of been in this state where I do a little bit of both at one time. And so I wanted to go quickly through what the roles of these are. So the designer for me is somebody who creates the idea It doesn't necessarily mean that they're drawing it, doesn't necessarily mean that they're always sculpting it, but they're communicating it to you through some medium, right? But they sometimes when you meet a designer or you see a design, what they do is intentional, right? They know exactly what they want. Sometimes they're just sketching and finding shape, tone, rhythm, and they end up with something appealing, but they don't always know how to communicate that or what that is. Now, the modeler is somebody who executes the design. This can also be a sculptor, but what I see from a modeler's position is somebody who needs to decipher or decode what the intentions of the design were. And if it was a loose sketch, you got to be able to figure out what makes it cool, right? So if you're working with a designer, or you're finding what they're doing, if you're receiving concept art, your job is a lot of ways to think like a translator and to try to understand what they were thinking. So if you're understanding what the lines were, what the rhythms were, what the shapes were, it can actually make you a better modeler, because you are now thinking as a designer. You're not thinking as a copier. And I think that's a really important step for modelers of all ranges to know, so that you can start to bring in more design sense into your models. I always put this in here. If you're a modeler anywhere in the industry, but if you're a modeler especially, just be nice. Be super nice. Especially if you're working as a modeler, what you're going to see often is people are going to do concept art and their perspective doesn't line up, or there's an issue. If you approach them and you say, like, this doesn't work, you're going to already creating a really bad relationship with them, basically telling them your work doesn't work, right, in 3D. So what you want to do is you want to approach them in different ways. So if you're able to think about what they're doing, you can actually be all of these things at once and create this sort of yin yang, right? Where you're thinking about how something works, but you're also thinking about how to make an appealing shape. And that's kind of something we'll definitely get into today. And the way that I do this is I like to, again, that's kind of the thing I'm going to talk about today, is getting into the final product as fast as possible, but also working loose and working low. So I don't necessarily spend a bunch of time getting to the end, like, result. I try to get just enough to know that what I'm going to get there and know where it goes. So I'm going to jump into ZBrush real quick.
So while you're doing that, how long do you usually work on a personal piece, and do you set yourself a deadline?
I usually work on a personal piece for no more than 2 months, and I'll set up certain deadlines for myself. I haven't done one in a long time, but like the Comic-Con challenge was a really big thing that I enjoyed, because I actually prefer challenges because they give me an external deadline. So I really recommend to artists of any type to get into challenges, even if you don't like post and participate in them, but to give you that sort of like accountability partner of, like, I have to do X amount of things, or this is how I have to submit, or this is when it's due. That's kind of what I do. Or I'll create my own. Like when I was working on the book on Essence Creatures has, had a deadline for when we needed to submit all the pages and make sure all the designs were done. And so working on something external like that really can be a really good way to do that. So one of the tools that I've actually been using quite a bit recently is the planes of the head that are already in ZBrush. They're in the project folder. So you can find them right here under head planes. And these are really, really great, because the planes, like just planes in general, planes and form are how you describe form, right? It's how you describe a shape. And having these to be a building block to start working from, or just to explore shape, is a super valuable tool. So I use these quite a bit, and I actually stream on the Gnomon channel, but what I do almost every stream, and even in my normal workday, is I would sit down and do a sketch for 5, 10, maybe 20 minutes at the beginning of the day. Often when you sit down at the beginning of the day, you're thinking about other things. You just got to, whatever that is. But now I want to sit and I want to sketch. So I've got a bunch of subtools here. And you'll kind of see that there's the more feminine one, and there's a more masculine one, the planes of the head. But I kind of just sculpt on top of these, and you can kind of see just adding form to something that already exists. exploring different shapes with these. And I'm not spending a lot of time on these. I'm not claiming that these are fantastic works of art. This is a sketch to get myself warmed up and also to explore forms. So we've got a couple different of these, different shapes, getting into some more caricature, right? Some more Dick Tracy style things, right? More aliens, just removing features. And then I have some other things in here, like let's say I wanted to, I always like doing accessories, so you can get the hairstyles in here, right? We got the emo hairstyle, kind of more of my slowly receding hairstyle, little beard action, right? So I like doing all this kind of stuff because it's like a nice way to be able to visualize something quickly, right? At this point, I'm not spending, like if we go, let's just start making one, like let's sculpt on this one. I'll turn all these other ones off. I'm not going to spend more than 5 to 10 minutes on this. I'm just going to build into the shapes. I'm going to duplicate it first. I usually use the clay build-up brush in case anybody's curious, but I always start kind of building these forms here, and I'll often just start by blocking out some masses. And at this point, what I'm really thinking about is how forms overlap, what's on top and what's on bottom and how they intersect. I'm going to start here, and we'll just kind of build some of these forms. The clay buildup brush is really, really excellent for this because you can just quickly kind of put it like a slab down, and often you'll see it's going to overlap different parts of the forms, but it's also not going to completely destroy them. And you can get these really nice shapes. So I'm just looking for, at this point, eye shapes, essentially. This person looks very tired, so I'm going to keep going with this one. Like me, I have a 3-month-old, so this is exactly how I feel.
How's that sculpting going? Like, do you get time? Have you figured out the time frame for you to do
A
some
little bit, yeah.
with the baby?
It's definitely a challenge, right?
Yeah.
He's a pretty good sleeper, but it's kind of this constant brain drain, in a good way. But it's something that you always are thinking of. So what I'm doing is I'm using the planes that are already here, right? The power of using something like this is it doesn't take me more than 5-10 minutes to explore some shapes, right? I can quickly come in, knock away planes, add planes. Of course, you can use the move tool. I use hotkeys for my brushes in case anybody's curious. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just like if you're playing a first-person shooter, is my favorite 6 brushes. So I just replace those, and that's basically move, clay, standard, clay buildup, and dame standard, and then inflate for occasional usage. I do use the H polish brush when I'm getting into more hard surface or defining forms sometimes, but otherwise I kind of use the same 6 or so sculpting brushes. I come in now with like the damn standard brush and start defining some of these shapes. I find that whenever I'm sculpting a nose, this is a little tip that I always give people. The number one thing I can tell you is sculpt it from the bottom first and carve in the nostril, and then shape it from the bottom. You have a pretty good idea, I'm sure, of what a bottom of a nose should look like. You've probably looked at yourself in the mirror enough that you know what that looks like. So if you do that and focus on that really quickly, you can get a nice nose shape, because this is a big kind of thing that helps define those forms that people don't really think about. Then we can start adding lips. I always make sure that there's a little bit of a barrel to the mouth, meaning that there's a roundness to it. If you often see that your sculpts have this kind of quality, where they just look a little flat, that's probably because there's not enough of an underlying form there. But fortunately, the planes of the head that are in ZBrush already have this. So I can either build a little bit of a barrel to the mouth, or at this point I can even just start creating some of these forms. So maybe I'll get a underlying form here for these lips, and then I'll just start drawing some on top. Lips for me are always one that take a little bit longer just because they're more complex. And the way that I work in general is more iterative, and another way I've kind of described it before is more like an evolution. So whatever you see at the first stage is not going to be the best. It's not going to be the prettiest. It's not even going to be the most effective way to communicate it. but it does slowly get there over time.
So for when you're working on this, is it bones, muscles, or fat pads that is the main structure for you to follow?
Almost always bones. Almost always bones. I am, I kind of what I often do, like if you can even kind of see what I'm doing here, is I've basically outlined the skull shape, right, and what's going in that cavity, and then I'm kind of outlining more of the skull shape, and eventually, I'll start defining like this is kind of where the nose is going to go, and this is where the end of the bone is going to be, and where the edge of the cartilage is. So just slowly working it up. But this is the process that I use for, and I've been using this actually for any head sculpt, because sometimes I'll do alien sculpt, I'll do whatever, aliens, demons, creatures, monsters, and all that kind of stuff. If they have what I'm going to expect to be a relatively humanoid face, I'll often start with this rather than a sphere. If I'm doing something that's a little different, I will go in and sculpt with this, just like a polysphere or a Dynamesh. I'm always looking for forms, and forms to me build off of bones first. I can always build up stuff later before I get into too much, muscle. Unless there's intending to be a very muscly character for whatever reason, then maybe I'd look for muscle. At this point, I've gotten pretty far enough along that I can go back and forth. I'll turn on solo mode here, but you can see I've added forms to this face. They're not beautiful. I could spend hours and hours and hours on this, but even just between this one and this one, which are both using the same underlying structure, you can start to explore different types of characters, different types of people. And what I like about this, and what you'll see on some of these other ones, is at this point I already have a pretty clear picture of what this person is going to be. So I can either spend hours trying to refine this, right? But I don't really need to. What all I have to do is just hone in on some of the areas that I want to work on. So we'll define this character's eyes in a second. I'm just going to flesh them out a little bit more and then show you, just like give it some volume. Now I could obviously Dynamesh the whole object, right? That's something that I'm sure we're all aware of. But what I actually want to do is keep this as low as possible, because I like working low because it's easier for me to adjust, right? It's easier for me to sculpt on. I've never been the sculptor who can just sculpt at a crazy high Dynamesh and remesh over and over and over. That's not really the way that I'm comfortable working. So what I like to do is keep everything very low. And the things that I found that would be really cool in some of the new ZBrush tools is the Sculptris Pro features. And so if I'll hide, I'm on solo mode here, but you'll see some of these other characters, like this character, for example, the areas back here are still exactly the same resolution, but the areas up here, you can see I've been using Sculptris Pro in certain regions to get a little bit more fidelity in just those locations. So I'm going to use that over here, up to this guy, turn on solo mode, and I'm just going to turn on Sculptris Pro. And at first, what I'm going to do is just do a very light smooth across the whole object, just kind of tapping the surface. And that for me is almost just giving it a little bit of like a local, make it a little smaller, local geometry here, just so I have a little bit of more geometry. And then I'm going to turn on my, I have Damien Standard on here. I'm going to carve this out. So you'll see that's already adding every geometry every time I sculpt here. Both the top and the bottom. I might want to turn this off, maybe focus on the eye shape that I'm making at this point, right? I'm just kind of sculpting into what's already there. And then something I've been doing quite a bit, you see in some of the other ones, is also sculpting in the iris. So I can also mask this. A lot of traditional sculptors will bring in something like this. At this point, even though the mesh is really almost exactly the same, I'm just only refining the areas that I need to refine. Right? And I think this is a really powerful tool. And so it makes it a really easy way to work, because all I have to do, let's say you're, and especially if you're in a production, right? Is this something? This is obviously only 5 minutes, but if I spent 20 minutes refining the areas that I need, or maybe we're making a bunch of heads, I could quickly come through and sculpt 15, 20, 30 heads in a day that at least give me a sense of what the future of them is going to look like. So this is a really powerful tool, right? To be able to visualize what you want very, very quickly in a way that I didn't used to be able to do this in ZBrush before, right? Where I used to have to dynamesh it. And for me, I like to work, like I said, low. And if I'm going to go up a step, if I'm going to add subdivisions or I'm going to dynamesh it at a higher level, often what I'll do is then I'll work the whole model in the round. Like I'm going to work the whole character all at once. And so for me, this is kind of creating ways so that I can shortcut that to see the end very, very quickly, which is great. I'm a huge fan of this feature for sure. So this is kind of a new thing that I've been playing around with, just how to get to final things very, very quickly. Now, this isn't how I'm going to make a final, resolution model. Obviously, I would spend more time to get there. This is a way to visualize. And so at this point, I'm going to jump into another project that I've been working on. And so I had the idea to kind of make something that would be like a Jaeger versus a kaiju. Right, and so I have this kind of this big battle scene, and so what I did was I did 2 sculpts, and the first sculpt I did was sort of this large, kind of lanky, demony horned thing, right? And this is using a base mesh that I've used before. So this is just a very simple mesh that I've extruded and pulled around, and sculpt to this kind of a point where I can at least see what the end result is, right? And again, this is the way that I like to work. This is only 60,000 points here. So I don't need for me to go days and days and days more of sculpting when I could sculpt this in 3 hours, right? And have an idea of what the final result is going to be. I already have a picture of what this is going to be, right? Now, I didn't really have a clear picture of what I was going to do after I sculpted this for my Jaeger. So I just wanted to explore shapes. And so what I did was I just started sculpting a bunch of random shapes together. And I ended up with something like this. And as you can see, this is very, very rough. I'm pulling the mesh all over itself. The geometry is not good. The geometry is very high, right? It's intersecting with itself all the time. And the point of this is not, or what I was doing here was not to make the best model I could. This was just to explore the shapes and also have it up. I often will do this. I use the sort of screenshot feature where you can have something up on your screen. You can put it in a spot, and I hit Shift S to put that on the screen. They'll bring in my other character, and I want to say, like, this character is probably going to be a little shorter. This Jaeger's be a little shorter than this kaiju. So I'm going to start sculpting things here that I can compare against all the time. So again, kind of the mindset of forward thinking, what's the future going to be? So I'm going to start loading up some of these other tools here to kind of give you a sense. Again, I said earlier, my process is very evolutionary. It's very iterative. So you're going to see how what I'm thinking slowly evolve. And so the first sculpt you have here, and this is going to be the second sculpt. So one of my favorite parts of ZBrush is that when you load up all these tools, that we can go back to them, right? We'll be able to click on them over and over, and they'll be in the same space. So you can see this is the exact same sculpt. And what I'm doing here is I'm taking some of these initial shapes. So this kind of these V lines that are kind of in the center of the chest that are looking good, right? There's something that's interesting to me, but it's not a mech at this point, right? It's not a Jaeger. So I'm starting to take those ideas of what was happening here, things sticking out of the neck, these kind of horns, these big V shapes, some sort of a large shoulder pad shape, and implementing them. And as I load up, you'll see that there's sort of the slow transition. This is probably one of the bigger transitions. And what you're seeing here is I realized that this character here just looks like a person in a suit of armor, right? It could be a knight. It could be anything at this point. So I really needed to push the idea that this was going to be a really large mech, and that meant that the shoulder width needed to be really, really far apart so that it couldn't be confused with having a person inside of it. So I'm intentionally, you can see, taking that chest piece and pulling it apart, and I'm breaking it so that the arms are basically going to hang perfectly vertical. Right. All right, so I'm going to keep going through some of these sculpts, adding on some different shoulder pads here. And here you can see I start to play around. So we started here, going here, dunk, 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 and this is where the final mech starts to take form. And you can kind of see the slow iterative process of what I'm working through. To where now I've kind of got this point here, and I start stretching it out and playing with some more shapes. I think I did miss one. Yeah. So here, 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 and then kind of this final one is where we are now, which is here. So this is a lot of meshes. It's 29 meshes. It's not too many, right? But when you look at some of these actual bits here, I'm going to get that little kaiju off. What we're seeing is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, multiple meshes in one spot. So again, I'm visualizing the end result. I'm not really caring about what the final is. So, but you can see this slow kind of process of my thought process of working the model in the round. So I'm always working the full character, even if it's at this point. You'll see I'm trying to create shapes here, trying to slowly bring out areas. Even if it's destroying the model, it's representative of what the final is going to be, right? Getting closer and closer to the final result. Here you can see every iteration, I'm working as much of the final. Looks like I am neglecting the legs a little bit, but I'm slowly working my way up to where at this point I've decided there's going to be some sort of a jetpack. I want these shoulders to be much larger. I'm playing with the ideas of how these shoulders should play with from here to here. You see this is a big shift in the shoulder area, but they're not really playing well together. And so now this pass and this pass is taking it to get to something that all starts to work together and to feel something that's cohesive. Now, this project is definitely a larger project, right? It's definitely going to be something that's going to take quite a long time. So this is actually the final one here I'm loading up. And this is a little character here that I put in for scale. I load all these up. These other things.
So for you, is it harder for you to sculpt male or female figures when you're working?
Female figures for me are I think more difficult, and I think that becomes I think that comes down to just typically, more feminine features are considered more round, right? And masculine features are considered more hard edges. And I think it's just easier to sculpt a harder edge, right? It's easier to sculpt hard defined planes that interlock with each other, whereas feminine features are softer and they're more subtle. So subtle is much harder for me. So this is the scale of this little guy, what the intent is going to be. So you can see it's a pretty big Jaeger, and this is intended to be very Pacific Rim style for sure. And then I've also added in here kind of the Jaeger, or sorry, the demon. And I've also spent quite a bit of time working on that design as well. So even comparing them, I don't think they'll be in the same location, but iterating through this as well. Similar process of trying to find designs and shapes that are going to work together, but also be a nice contrast to what the actual character that they'll be facing is going to be. And so, again, the whole process of what I'm doing here is very much intended to be as getting to the end result as fast as I possibly can, right? Getting to the end result, being able to visualize what the final is. So even though I haven't completed my model here and I haven't completed my model here, what I'm doing is getting to the final so that I can compare them against each other early, before I get into making the final model? Do they look like opponents that would be interesting, that I would be interested in finishing, that it would make an interesting composition, and just kind of do they seem like something that I want to continue with, right? Often, you know, in projects or productions, what you'll see is hundreds of pieces of concept art for a character, right? And that's very common for a character, multiple characters, for scenes, environments, all kinds of things. And most of them don't get picked, right? Most of them don't get picked, and that's okay, because you get to the point where you can kind of visualize and see, you know, is this going to be something that's going to work for me at the end result? Yes or no? If so, you move forward with it. If not, you put it away for later, right? So it's kind of a fun process. And what I even do to go one sort of step further with this is at this point, I even start blocking out the final result. And so I want to do a series of illustrations with this. And so I've taken, you know, kit bash stuff here, posed my characters so that I can even start playing with what my final, maybe even a composition could be. So these are decimated characters that I posed. Again, this is not intending to be the final result. This is not intending to be exactly what the image is going to be, but it gets me a very good roadmap. I've always seen that if you have a good roadmap or a good foundation for what the end result is going to be, that you can make the steps to get there faster, a little easier as well, because you have an idea of what it's going to be. And it's also a really good way to get feedback, right? So at this point, I can take this, even though I've spent, you know, let's say I've spent a week on this, getting both characters sculpted, get this pose, get some ideas in there. I can throw this over to my friends, or if I'm working on a production, I can throw this over to my art director. And this is very art directable. And that's a really key component, rather than saying, oh, I spent 3 months on this model, right? It's finally textured, it's being lit in another engine or whatever. This shortcuts that process. And if they say, you know, no, I don't like this, or hey, here's something you can improve, you can get there really, really quickly, because you're still at the place, again, like with this, what this model looks like, you're still at the place of a place where you can make changes. You're at a place that's easily art directable, and you're not at a place where you're kind of stuck saying, oh, you know, I see this a lot, especially a lot from more junior artists, where they are at a place where they've worked on a piece for so long, right? And they ask you for feedback, and you give them feedback, but they say, oh, that would be so much work to change this, right? It would be so much work to remodel this whole piece, to retexture this whole piece, to repose the whole thing. It's so much work and effort to do that they don't do the feedback, right? They don't do it because it's too much time and effort. In production, you're forced to do that, right? That's just part of how it works. But whenever you're doing a personal piece, I find that being able to ask my friends, being able to ask other people, is a really good way to make the final piece better, right? So trying to get to art directable as fast as possible.
And when you're doing that, when you're getting where the scene you just had up, are you just using Gizmo to move the shapes around, or using Transpose Master to move?
I like Transpose Master. I think for me, Transpose Master is good because, well, first of all, like if we look at like this model, well, that's not the model, but this model, there's so many little pieces, right? Some are big, some are small, but sometimes, you know, the legs seem to be one whole piece. The abdomen seems to be one whole piece. The head is 5 different meshes, right? So what I like to do is I like to go straight into T-Pose Master, and just at this point, again, especially so early, I really kind of treat it like this is an action figure. Like I'm just going to break this thing till it gets in the position and the pose that I want. So as you can see, like in here, we just highlight everything else except for this character. The joints, even though it's decimated, you can kind of see, like, look at the back of this arm. This is destroyed. Like, there's nothing in here that's really useful for me as far as like what the final result, the final model, the final pose would be. But it is extremely useful to do early and say, like, what is the pose of this going to feel like? How should this feel? You know, even let me see if I can quickly find another one because I have another one up. Load up this other scene. So this is me exploring different poses, right? So maybe it's sort of like a running pose. This one doesn't have, I think, all this. The city, oh, it does, yeah. A bigger city in the background, right? Maybe there's some sort of a running. I was thinking about, like, you often see in like kaiju Jaeger, movies where there's the kind of running atop the torso is atop all these buildings. So exploring these shapes, what that could look like, right? So this stuff I just pose pretty roughly, and I do that just so I can kind of see the result, right? As fast and as quickly as possible. And the things I like about transpose, the action lines in transpose master, is some of the multiple functions that you can do of bending an elbow, quickly posing an arm and then bending an elbow almost in the same motion. Stuff that I really like.
So when you were working in production, how fast were you expected to work in production for the final project production mesh versus the concept mesh?
That's a good question. The concept mesh, I would say, like on a big, like let's just use something like Iron Man as an example. Iron Man, most of those suits would take me 4 to 6 weeks to complete, right? And so that means that includes all the art direction. So I need to have, that doesn't mean I can just say, all right, I submitted it at 6 weeks and it's done. I submitted it at 4 weeks and it's done. I need to have multiple steps in between there that are going to give them time to art direct. So my Ryan Meinerding, or Phil Saunders, who I worked with a lot on a lot of those suits, I would basically give them a model and I would hand it off to them so that they could do paint overs or whatever they wanted to do, give them some time to think about it so that they could actually give it the thought rather than just kind of the over the shoulder, I don't like this, I don't like this, I don't like that. They could actually spend some time to give it some thought and give some real notes, but that requires way more time, right? So let's say, again, 6 weeks, I would probably need at least have a concept mesh. I would almost always ask, like, hey, give me a couple days to a week to just give me, like, without any feedback, just so I can take this as far as possible. I can work out as many problems that I see as possible, and then hand it off to you, and then we can start that kind of feedback loop. So I guess to answer the question, I would say about a week to get to what I would say is like a really solid art directable state, right? So if this was our Iron Man that we were working on, an equivalent of that would be like this. I would need to get to at least the minimum this state as fast as possible so that I could have them start looking at it, right? And then from there, it's a building process, and that's why 4 to 6 weeks. Sometimes it was a background suit, and you only got 3 or 4 weeks to work on something. Sometimes it's more of a hero suit, and you've got 6 weeks to work on something. But yeah, kind of that time range.
Your buildings that you were showing, I'm assuming you were making that in Maya?
These are actually the Kitbash 3D.
Okay.
So just bringing their stuff in. Their stuff is nice because you can bring in libraries and just kind of throw it in, and I just use it as potential things. You can actually see some of the libraries over here. Have multiples on top of themselves. But again, to visualize is really what the tools are for. But this is kind of my general process, and you'll see that in some of this. I think we were talking before, like, do I bring in color? Is one of the questions you had. So you'll see some of these are actually colored already. Right, so this one doesn't have color. This one has some beginnings of color, and you can all see where I'm starting to explore what some of those shapes could be. I think at this point I did end up losing the color. Oh no, there we go. So what some of these lines could be on the character, and that's not so much for color, but it's for big graphic reads. Right, so certain characters are really defined by a big graphic read, and some are not. Right, so you're gonna or a single element that you're gonna see, and so certain, like, I'm gonna actually load up some other things for a project I've been working on I'll pull up my Photoshop here, and you'll see this is a series. If you guys have been following any of the Fan Art 6 stuff that was going a little while ago, this is my Fan Art 6 that I've been working on slowly. And so I've been doing all of these in ZBrush, right? ZBrush sculpts and basically ZBrush renders for all of them. And it's been fun to do kind of fan art for this, because what I like doing, and whether you're remaking a very popular character or you're doing fan art or whatever, I find that certain characters, I kind of treat each one of them as a masterclass, because each character that you're remaking has something about it that is iconic, and it has something that makes that character that character. And you can kind of push that for a while, and you can push that and you can break that for a while. If you push it too far, nobody's going to recognize it. You won't even recognize it. If you don't change it at all, it's still a good process to go through if you ever want to do just straight up fan art of something, because you're able to, if you treat it not just as a copier, but like kind of what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, which is, what is it that makes it that thing? Kind of trying to understand the translation of what is it that makes something interesting. You can really get pretty far with that, which is cool, because you can break those down individually. So some of the ones that I did early would be like Gray Fox. This is an early character that I ended up doing. So something that's interesting, for example, about a character like Gray Fox from Metal Gear is that as a character, he's basically just, I'll move the sword so we can look at the rest of this. He's basically relatively formless, right? It's skin tight, right? If you look at the character, it's formless. It's focusing on detail, and the detail is supposed to be very precise and very high precision, right? So when you're thinking about designing and you're thinking about what this character is, everything you has to do kind of has to boil down into skin tight ninja is essentially one term we might use for that, right? You might say precision, right? So really tightly, high tech. And then also another area of this is it needs to be very graphic, and it kind of needs to be an opposite of the character of Snake, right? Snake being basically wearing grays and blacks and olives, whereas Gray Fox does not. So he needs to have a very bold color profile. And even if I just put this out there, maybe some fans would know, right, if I do a sculpt of this, but the color is really what's making it stand apart to say this is a recognizable character. So some characters, color is incredibly important, right? Some characters, it's just when you're sculpting, it's not. So I'm going to jump through some other files actually that I already have loaded up, or I'm going to load up to kind of show you this off a little bit. Other characters that don't, like, this is a character that most of you, if you're viewers, likely know who this is, right? And this is a character that doesn't really need to have color in the definition. It will help, right? If I turn on all these colors, you'll see that you can likely see that this is a Samus sculpt, right? Or my interpretation of Samus. But this is a character that doesn't need sculpt, because there's already some really key design elements in there. And so that's kind of fun to do these fan art things, because you get to play around with them and you get to see what makes a character, right? We'll load up a couple more here. We'll get into, I'm doing Abe. Abe is one that was kind of fun. He was actually a really difficult one, because he has so many different interpretations. And so just trying to find a mix sort of the comic interpretation and the movie interpretation, because they're actually quite different. And you can see I ended up breaking. So these illustrations that I did, I actually work in doing a 3:1 aspect ratio is one of my favorite aspect ratios. I have a couple posters in my house that I really like of this. And what I found is a really challenging aspect ratio to work in. So similar to what I was saying before, is I'll actually take this and I'll change the actual background. And I'll start working very, very early in this. And I'll zoom this out just a little bit. And what I'll do is I'll actually create my poses in the aspect ratio in ZBrush using the document to visualize that. So at this point, I have my character, right? He's posed, he's swimming, or he's up against the glass. You can see this is the final model. I'd actually broken the arm. I completely severed it here. And the reason I did that is because I was kind of posing him and saying, okay, maybe I want him to be up against the glass or something like this. And I was using the cameras, storing a camera here. Toss this over here. Store. Just name it as 1. All right, so I can move this, go back to 1. What I was using is I was actually using this as a separate object to move around. So I can, once I get my framing, now I'm playing with everything else in framing. Where's his head going to be? What's the overall composition going to be? How can I move this around? Do I want to rotate this hand, right, so that it feels like it's on the glass? And it was a really good way for me to visualize, again, the final result quickly. But I'd start doing this very early. So I would actually take this, and I would just do a quick and dirty screenshot. You could obviously export the document, but I would do this multiple times and just bring it into Photoshop and paste it on top. Have multiples sitting over themselves and say like, hey, okay, what angle do I like most? What pose do I like most? And quickly be able to visualize that really, really quickly. So again, certain characters are going to need color. This character did not. But what was important for me was the final composition. So this is probably the one that I ended up spending the most time with compositionally, trying to get it so that his hand would kind of be stuck to the glass. Some other ones, we'll load up Bosk, which is a character that went very, very slowly. So this character I struggled with for a really long time because he's just kind of a challenging, goofy character to begin with. So I started off doing just using a base mesh and sculpting. You can see I ended up sculpting a head here separately from the body. And then we'll load up some of these other ones. And this is where I started to get in some color relatively early. So blocking out where his pads were going to be, you know, this kind of white vest he has, this kind of yellow suit he has, these straps and things. This is all actually pretty important to me to start to be able to place everything in all at one time. So you can see that I eventually kind of work my way from here to here through the final, well, here to here to here to the final model, doing some poly paint here to kind of start breaking that up as well. And then eventually doing a pose as well. But the color is important, right? Certain characters you'll notice are very, very important. And the next one, the RoboCop I'm going to pull up next, is one of the best examples I've actually seen, because this is what I started off with, right? Now this is a pretty, I think it looks really funny actually. But if I turn this off, put on any other material, fans of the character might get what I'm going for here, right? But I think the average person is just going to think that this is, you know, I think maybe just this dome on top is the only thing, or this chin strap, or the only thing that really start to evoke RoboCop at all. But being able to just put color on very, very quickly, you get across the point of who the character is very fast. Even if it's this is not a good sculpt, right? This is not a good model right now. This is something I want to spend a lot more time on. But just because of the, you know, I have a little tiny RoboCop here, right? The graphical breakup of who this character is and how certain parts of the character work are very strong, right? And that's why you actually probably saw a lot of people not like the sort of the reinterpretation of RoboCop where he was all a black material, right? And they were like, oh, we wanted to be silver. And that's because that was the original thing that they liked. It wasn't necessarily the design so much. The design is cool, but it's the breakup of the character as a whole that really works. And so for me, when I start sculpting this a little further, getting this component down first, getting the proportions in play, right? You'll see that the proportions here, even though this one is further along, the proportions of this character versus this character are subtly changed, right? It's more of an overall height at this point. I'm not changing elbow lengths drastically. I'm not changing torso lengths drastically. It's just some subtle proportional tweaks that make it so that I can get to the final result very fast. And I'm able to do that because I'm not playing broad, right? When you start changing primary forms, you start changing large proportions, other things have to move around, right? If I'm pulling the arms out drastically, if I'm lengthening the lips, lengthening the torso, anything like that, it's really going to change how something works. And so being able to visualize with color is something I do, especially when I'm working on a character that I feel like has a really graphic breakup, right? So good question for sure about, getting into, we had this question before, I think, about how do I use color? How do we get into color? And this is kind of the way that I do it, because I find that for me, again, it's trying to find the point where you can get that snapshot, like that snapshot of what the end result is going to be. As soon as I can see that, I can now push all the pieces into play to get it to be something that works really well. It looks like it's going to take a minute to save this file, because I think I've loaded many tools all at once. So this project is going to be a big one.
So then I'll ask you a question then. So when you're going with your base forms, what are your steps to start getting into now? You want to start adding details. Like obviously that RoboCop you had up was very loose, and now he's getting to have a little bit more form here. So what's your process for going through those steps?
Sure. The first thing for me is always going to sort of be the proportions, blocking out the proportions, right? So when we're looking at this, what I'm doing at this point, I'll see if I can load up one that's kind of in between of this, just for visualization, but I'll sculpt on one anyways. It's even a little further. Here we go. So this is kind of like step one, right? And this is like sort of one, step two. Now there's not a huge difference here, right? So this is what you'll actually start seeing is kind of this slow progression. And a lot of my work is it is slow. Like it looks like it evolves slow. And what I'm doing at this point from step A, step one to step two, is I'm taking all of the things that I blocked in, like this looseness. So I'm taking this collar here. Oh, okay. That happens.
No liking the collar.
Yeah, right. I think it's because I have all these tools open. It's almost like you shouldn't load every possible file all at once. Let's close that.
Yep.
All right, load that real quick. But what you'll see is I'm basically loading up individual, or I'm adjusting the individual pieces all at once. And part of that early work for me is, even though it's loose, is sort of a foundational ground setting for what the rest of the model is going to be. And just quickly go, yeah. Okay, get this one up. We'll get this one up. So even though this is loose, what are the key things that I'm putting in here that I know are going to be in the character for the future? I know that the character has this sort of collar, right? I know he has these really large divots here for his shoulders. He has these kind of large round shoulders. He has this really large planar chest piece, right? All these, this really basically doesn't have like a belt of any sort. His legs just kind of stick on at the bottom with this really big angle. So his kind of abdomen is very, very, or appears to be very long. So what I'm doing when I switch to this other one, I guess I'll just have this one over here, back and forth, is every element isn't actually going away. I'm just refining it. So the collar, as you see here, is just being shaped to be just basically spending a little bit more time with each element. The chest is just being shaped. The shoulders are being shaped. And I'm just adding in those small elements to just refine it. So like if I was going to go back in, let's just do it from sort of from scratch here. What I'll do is I'll just start pulling this in, right? So this has a mesh underneath this that I would probably need to adjust or sometimes just, hide. I'll just pull this in using the move brush for this, for example. Then I'll use like the clay buildup brush or the Damien standard brush to start defining shapes. So I know that I want a mask here. Yep. He has like these very defined bicep shapes. So I'll probably just carve in that I want this bicep shape. He has a very clear definition on that. I'm going to take these shapes, I'm just going to define them. So I'm going to use the Damien standard brush a little bit. He has a very clear like separation for like this sort of peck shape. So start defining that. And also playing with the planes of it as well. Maybe I'll use like a planer brush or the polish brush or something to help define those shapes.
Is that your go-to for say something like him when you're working on with your H polish brush?
I use it to like define, yeah. So like I use the I use like the standard or the clay buildup or the Damien standard to create the sketch, right? Or to get the shape there. But once I want it to be defined, like let's say I've got this whole collar here, this is working. Now I'll come in with the H polish brush and I'll define or refine that shape even further. So at this point, I'll just spend a little bit of time sculpting this up, right? Defining some of these planes. And it's just kind of a slower process, right? Like I almost always work in the round. So I'm going to go from here to here to here to here. So you see I started with the collar, and then I bounced to the chest, and now I'm bouncing to the arms. And it's just kind of slowly building up the whole, right? I'm not really trying to think of it as, I'm spending 30 minutes on the arms and I'm spending 30 minutes on the chest. And, once I get done with this piece, I'll move on to this piece. And that's because to me, they all have to play together. So you'll see, kind of where I'm getting at, but from this to this is another step that I can say, okay, now that I've got this piece in play, I had this a little larger here at this point. We'll load up the end one as well. Each one of these I slowly have adjusted. When you see this point to this point, it's a jump, but it's not a massive jump, right? And that's kind of the goal, is that each one of my saves or iterations or adjustments is going to be one step further that gets me to the final result. And I find that even though it seems like it goes slow, right? Like I'm not making a massive stab. Like I almost never make a really massive effort into finalizing an area of something, even which I think can appear to look slow, but it actually for me works relatively fast. And for me, it's more about, rather than trying to do a lot of stuff really quick, right, and make a big effort in just one direction, it's about saving myself time by not creating or not making mistakes, right? I find that if I'm over here and I'm, if I'm trying to work really fast and I'm, define this area in, and I'm going to pull this out, and, I'm going to use this brush because it's definitely going to give me the shape that I want for here, and we're going to carve this out. And, if I try to move fast and do something, I'll get action, but am I getting results that I want, right? Whereas if I move a little more methodically, I know that every step that I'm taking is a step forward, and it's not a step that's in a different direction, right? Often I found myself earlier in my career trying to, there's sort of the quality versus quantity questions, right? And I think that being able to produce quantity is great. But for me, I found that if I attempted to produce quantity and to go very fast in my work, I very often was having to go back and rework tons of stuff over and over and over because I didn't give it the time, right? There would be an area that was great, but the rest of it sucked. And I would have to go get everything else up to that area. And so it was kind of a challenge that I found. And actually, I think it's from the mentality that I try to use is to treat it more like what I imagine, a Renaissance master doing, right? Yes, they do sketches, and yes, they do all different types of things, and they want to explore things very quickly. But the way that they're able, right, from what I imagine, they were able to do things, so many things, is by not making mistakes, right? At a certain point, once you understand something well enough, you try to not make mistakes, or you try to eliminate how many mistakes you can make, instead of trying to just say, oh, well, I now I've mastered something, I can work 5 times faster. Right, that's not for me how it works. So just a little bit of a different mindset, I guess.
So when you're doing this, do you find yourself using one particular material? And what about your lighting? Are you just keeping the lighting pretty much default lighting?
I have some of these are I found on ZBrush Central. These are I think by ZBro or Undaz. And so these are just some straight up, they're kind of relatively flat. I use these quite a bit. And they're more or less just different colors of the same style of material, right? But they can give me just enough flavor that if I want it to be something specific, if the character or creature has a certain color of skin or whatever, I can find something that works for that. If I want it to feel like I'm sculpting in clay, right, I can sculpt in clay. And I will switch between matte caps every, I don't know, hour. Every 2 hours I switch between matte caps. I'll switch into basic material. I'll pull out the lights occasionally, and just kind of play with this to check forms, right? But I also spend a lot of time just rotating around the model. But often I'll use, you see some of these sort of other materials, blend materials, but I kind of find that I like this kind of flattish material. Nothing with cavity detection on it. Nothing with, something that's adding anything really to the sculpt from a graphical angle. I want it to just be flat, right? I just want to be able to evaluate the form best I can, because that's what I'm doing. Is I'm always rotating, always kind of evaluating. Something I always do is I always look from the top. Look from the top, look from the bottom, right? That's how I try to avoid characters feeling like they're cubes, right? They're just like fronts and backs with sides, but trying to get characters that have slopes and angles, and how, for example, this, I hadn't had this before, but this angle here is kind of this nice arc that's all the way across. It would be nice if the shoulders, for example, played into that a little bit more. So maybe there's this sort of like arcing from the top. I don't know what that looks like from the side or from the front, but I can say maybe that's a cool element that gives it this consistent draft. Right? I always look at, these angles and these rhythms between things and characters, and try to get things to connect as much as possible. So the lighting is definitely something I play with, and it's important, but it's more for me that making sure that all these shapes start to play really well together. So this is like before and after of that. And a lot of the stuff I do is kind of subtle in that way. It's a lot of these little subtle tweaks. So like, for example, the change that I just did to the arms is apparently only on this side. But it's not massive, but it's enough that I think, combined with all the other tweaks that I might do, that it's going to feel more cohesive, right? So always looking for that sort of relationship in the model. And I do that very early, and that's part of what the early sketches I was showing you was, right? I'm looking for those things early. So it's not a coincidence for me that like this line lines up with this line, and it's kind of catching up in here with this line. Like, those are design elements that I'm putting in as early as I possibly can, right?
So since you worked on so many Iron Man suits, was there an aha moment, like, you did, like, by the fifth one, oh, this is the workflow that I find to do now all the pieces for him,
right,
that worked really well? Or was there a brush that you discovered, after like doing the third or second one, you're like, oh, this is perfect for the rest of the ones that I'm going to have to work on now? Anything that popped out?
In some ways, yes. That is actually why I started working on all the Iron Man stuff, was why I started working really low as possible. Iron Man is super detailed, right? Almost every version of Iron Man is pretty detailed. But the thing that I've seen is he has a really core set of proportions and a really core set of icon to that character that really can't change, right? The size and shape of like his actual body needs to stay relatively consistent, and his visor line, his eye line, and his RT shape really can't change. They can't move and they can't change that much. You can cut some things out, you can round them, you can soften them, all that. But what I found was that so much of Iron Man, for example, was these really long, consistent forms, right? Really, really long, consistent forms that would go from head to toe, right? They would go from toe to fingertip. The Mark 7 was actually the first one that I noticed that on. Is there's actual design lines in the character that that do that, and it's really interesting to me because you know that this isn't really getting to like a brush, right? That's not where I'm going to get with this. But what it does do is I'll make a new one. Right, so this is the Mark 7, for example. I'll just pull open a brush, make sure it's a color so we can all see it. Color, cool. So for example, this character has a line that goes all the way through here, and form is light creating shadow, right? So there's a light, it's going this direction, it's creating a shadow on this side. So we have a little line here that connects and goes through this line, connects through this line, connects through this line, kind of waves up through, right? So the aha moment that I had was when I was kind of taught this by Phil and Ryan over at Marvel, of all these little lines that and little details and little subtle planes that kind of sit in these areas, right, to create shape, that create these shadows, right? This shadow here. This stuff is all intentional in a model, in a character like this, right? We kind of come up around here, we go out the arms, we go down the arms through these, and we follow all these parallel lines, right? Follow all these lines and jut out the side of the hand, right? And that's, you can do this multiple times on this character. Like you can come out the toes, go through the side, you know, find all these parallel lines, use things like the hidden line technique, which is basically where your eye still is a bad circle, still makes a circle or a shape, even though the middle of it isn't there, right? So your eye is able to follow through all this. And what I realized really quickly was that this is a core component, right? These lines that I'm drawing are core components to the design, to the overall character, actually. And so it's not that I'm needing to get all this detail in for me, it's that I need to establish these relationships very early. And so that's why I work as low as I do for as long as I possibly can. This suit, as compared to, you know, another suit, for example, like the Mark 42, is actually completely different. I remember working on the Mark 7 and feeling like, oh, I've got this down. Like I definitely know how to make an Iron Man suit, right? At this point, I know how to make another one. But if I put in the Mark 42, what you notice right away is that they're completely different. The icons are the same, and yeah, the colors are flipped, right? And that's what the average person would say, is that the colors are drastically different. And that's honestly where most people's evaluation of the suit ends, right? But what you'll actually notice is that the forms are relatively, you know, they follow a similar design aesthetic. So it goes up through the legs again, right? Kind of travel up these knees. The form on the leg is actually very simple here, and it kind of kicks it up through these, and it follows this little zigzag of red and color through the arm, and it does the exact kind of same thing, right? So the overall fundamental relationships of what's happening in these forms is almost identical. And that for me is what my big aha moment was these relationships are in some ways more important. Now, this suit is drastically different because it's basically all focusing on form. This one is mostly focusing on color, it's an R, and detail, right? So you can't make this suit without the color relationships that you have here, and how certain parts of this are creating this big block of color is a bunch of detail that's colored in certain patterns to create a line so that your eye goes through it, right? There's no way to make the suit without having color and without having detail. And you can actually even see it, like if I just put on black and white, for example, what you see in this suit on the left is drastically different, because you're going to see all the form relationships of how the suit is being made, how the light is capturing how is creating shadow, and that's creating the rhythms throughout the suit. Whereas on the right hand side, there is light creating shadow, but in reality, what you're seeing is you're seeing all of these color relationships create lines that draw your eye through. So what does that mean from a tool perspective? That for me made me realize the form and the overall being able to visualize the end result is the most important thing. So the tools is using whatever tool is best at that. So what was really important for me in the Mark 7 was not as important for me on the Mark 42. The Mark 7 was about creating good form. So what ways, similar to if we're looking at this RoboCop or any of these other things I had shown you before, what ways can I create form in the best way and the fastest way possible? Whereas when I'm looking at that's a little man, hang on. Opening this up. There we go. Doing something like this is about form, right? If I'm going to compare these kind of characters to themselves or to what's already up on screen. This character is all about form right now. There's no color here, right? Whereas a character with like RoboCop that I was just playing with, I think I can argue that he's almost entirely about color, right? Yes, there's big form relationships and there's interesting things that are happening in here, but you can't have this character, right? If we can't break him down in the same way that we do here. So the tools that are important for me here is color. So I'm using polypaint, right? I'm using ways to visualize that very, very early. Whereas here, it could be sculptural, but it's only because I've got a good color relationship. So for me, it's all about understanding what makes the character and finding the tools that can get you there as fast as possible. So now notice also that I made these characters 5 years ago, depending on the character, right? Probably more now, which is insane. But a tool that I would use now for this, especially if I'm sketching and sculpting to get a concept sculpt done in ZBrush, I'm probably going to use a lot of Sculptris Pro to hone in on certain details. I'm going to use a lot of polypaint to break up these different things, right? Things to be able to define areas into different areas is really just dependent on the character. So it kind of ranges.
So at this point, someone's asked about
Sure.
cleaning up the meshes and retopologizing. I'd say the one on the left, your Jaeger, that's pretty much you're done, and now you want to go start cleaning up the shapes. That's as far as you take it, and then you start cleaning up the shapes, right?
Yeah, pretty much. The only thing I would say about like the Jaeger, for example, is that you see this if you're in production, or you're a modeler in a film, or you've ever seen anything like this, you're going to see that it's very common that a concept model is going to be handed off to you, and it is not going to be necessarily representative all the time of what the illustration or the render that they sold it with was, right? So there's a lot of super talented illustrators out there who can take what I have right now and turn it into a really great illustration, and then they're going to hand it off to a modeler, and the modeler, they're going to say, hey, make these into hands, and then this is your hand model, right? And you're supposed to make this a film quality asset based off of this. Yeah, this is pretty low res, right? But again, that's not the point of what this model was, right? That's not the goal of this model. The goal of this model is to sell an idea, to sell a shape to somebody, right? So some parts of this, yes, like the legs, for example, I could probably retop most of the legs. The feet are a disaster. I would need to spend a lot of time on the feet here. Same with the arms. I can retop the bulk of these arms and start understanding what some of the shapes inside of that are. The hands are a disaster. I'd have to work all that out. Other parts of this, I don't actually want to retop, right? Because I'm not spending a lot of time. Like look, this is several cylinders that I apparently have just hidden inside these shoulders for no real reason. So like they're creating a mass in there that it just needs to have some design work and some time spent in thinking out what that is. So I'd say yes and no. There's parts of this, like I think that this area, you know, kind of at here and here is going to be successful, relatively successful here. When we get into these areas, you know, this is going to be difficult to retop because, especially if this is supposed to be mechanical, there's not really any thought put into that right now. So I might want to put a little more thought into how those things function. Same with the hands is another area. And then just generally, like, you know, the hips and stuff like that, all the gears in the hips right now don't really function at all. So it's at a place where I can take it. It could be handed off. I could start retopping it. I could also spend a little bit more time, but I've got a pretty clear picture where it's going to go. So what I'll do is start retopping the whole thing, and I sometimes like to work with multiple projects at a time, right? So I'll basically start retopping. When I get bored of retopping, or I want to do something else, I'll come back in here and I'll spend some time on designing the hand for a little bit. So that's kind of I think how I would approach that.
Okay. And as an art director, how often are you, like especially when you're doing your Iron Man suits, how often were you having to check in? Was it, you'd mentioned, give me a week and before you send it to Ryan, and then after that, was Ryan checking in with you weekly? And you were an art director
every other day. Yeah, for sure. As I've been on both sides of that, of being an art director and being an artist, being art directed. On average, for like the Iron Man stuff, it would be every other day, every third day. Maybe we end on Friday and we have the week. Let's just play that out, I guess. We have the week. We check in on Monday. Maybe we do some notes. They check in with me on Wednesday, and then they check in with me on Friday. And then we kind of rinse and repeat at that point, maybe Wednesdays or Tuesdays and Fridays. And that's going to go all the way up until we get to a deadline for a meeting, meaning, hey, we need to show it this week. We need to show it next week, whatever. And, art direction will get a little tighter around those dates just so they can make sure that they have what they need for the meetings. But that's typically the relationship that I would see is, you're going to, I personally, and most of the people I've worked with are not ones that want to micromanage, right? I would prefer to hire somebody who's talented and let them work, and me just check in and kind of, do what a directorate should do, which is direct, like guide, rather than micromanage and pull it all around. So what I would do as an art director myself is I would often do a check-in every week, maybe every other week, but also just kind of walk around, and just kind of keep eyes on something. If something is looking off, drastically off for me as an art director, and I'm walking around the art pit, I would say something, right? Like, hey, let's address this right now, rather than saying, oh, well, next Friday or whatever, we're going to have a big meeting and I'm going to blast you with pages of notes. Like that's just a big waste of time for me. And it's a waste of time for me. It's a waste of time for the artist. I think we would all rather just kind of get to the point where we're working quickly and efficiently. And if somebody has questions that they should raise them, right? Rather than expecting that I'm always going to come in as an art director and to have the perfect answer, right? A lot of times I would do it in art director, and I saw this at Marvel a lot as well. There'd sort of be like little mini group discussions of like, we'd work on something back and forth. Let's say you and I are working on this, how do you like this? Oh, this is going good. It's going bad. I don't like this. We're kind of at a weird spot, or we're at a decision point of what we should do. And you kind of open it up to a person or a couple people around and be like, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think the right thing would be to solve this design decision, or just to what color should this be, or, to kind of open it up. And I find that also makes for a better vibe on the team when everybody's, not just invested in your own projects, but everybody's invested in the group as a whole. Helps quite a bit. So yeah, it kind of depends, but I always like to not micromanage, and on average, I wouldn't get notes more than 2 times a week. They also take a while to implement, and a lot of the time, the notes that would be given were thoughtful, right? So sometimes it would be, the note sessions could be as short as this is looking good, adjust this, but then also, hey, can you send me the model, or can you get me some screenshots so I can think about it later, right? So it's kind of like just always expecting that we're always giving the opportunity to the art director or the concept artist, if you are a modeler, to make it better, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to make the final product is the combination of everything. So any other questions out there?
I'm just looking at the questions.
Yeah, no worries.
Catching up. So how much of your time is art and how much of your time is meetings?
It's a good question. I think what you see as you kind of go up the chain of titles, right? If you're wanting to be an art director, a creative director, director, right? On average, you get more meetings when you go up, and that means you get less hands-on time. So when I was working as an art director and a creative director, very often I think you would see 10% or less, 15% or less of my time was doing art. Often it was in meetings, or it was doing paint overs, doing sketches, sitting down with other artists, doing reviews, solving problems like that. So it's a little hard, like when you become an art director, because you really want to do art, right? And that's what you're probably got into the industry for. But often the more you go up, the more you get removed from that. But at the same time, now you're able to kind of give a broader impact, right? So being able to affect multiple projects, multiple assets, whatever, at the same time, it does scratch the creative itch in a lot of ways. But that's why I would try to do as much personal work as possible, right? Try to balance so that when you're at home, you're making personal work, or as an art director, trying to make a couple concept pieces, a quarter or a year or a month or whatever your cadence is, to be able to balance that so that you're not, just finding yourself not doing art and only in meetings, because it is a thing. Like, I've definitely heard it. I've talked to many other art directors before who have, felt that, where it's, I'm only doing meetings all day, every day.
There's no art left, right?
Yeah. Just direction. It's not art anymore.
So when you're just starting out, would you recommend cutting your teeth trying to recreate a fan art, or experimenting on a custom creature?
I think there's a little bit of both. If you're just starting out, the number one thing I would want this person to do is to be having fun, right? Like, get into the tools and get it to be something where you're enjoying the process, or at least if you're getting into a point where you're trying to recreate. My concern would be you try to do fan art, and maybe you frankly just aren't there yet. You don't have the skills there yet, or you're struggling with the tools yet, and it's very frustrating for you. I think doing some initial stuff that's your own is great, but when you're ready to, and it'll get you the momentum to some understanding maybe of some what the tools are. When you're like kind of getting slightly beyond, like, the introductory level, getting into like the beginner level, you're understanding some of the tools, I almost always recommend people do a recreation of something from concept art, ideally 2D concept art as well. And that's because that's really going to stretch your brain into being more than just making whatever you want, right? If you make whatever creature you want, whatever monster you want, whatever mech you want every single time, you'll learn, absolutely, but you're not going to learn as much because you don't have a reference point of what you're trying to make. And so that's a really challenging thing to do, is to make something from an image, to make something from a reference point, because, like, I recommend, like, if somebody's wants to learn how to poly model something from scratch, right? I tell them almost always make a car. It's one of your first things you always make, is a car or a plane or a train or something, a tank, because you're making something from reference. And there's a very clear, did I make this, and did I succeed, or did I not succeed, right? And that is a really important bar to be able to judge yourself on, of how am I doing, how are my skills doing, what am I needing help on, and and then sometimes it'll also make you stretch yourself to try new tools or to try new things, right? When you're making things for yourself, you can make whatever you want. And often that means, especially at the beginning, you don't know what all the tools are. So you're going to be making stuff with the tools you know, whatever you're comfortable with. And that's not a great way to push yourself or to try new things, right? Whereas if you see a character or a concept and it's like, this, I don't know how to make this, especially if you're in school. Like if you're in your school and you're looking for something, like you want to learn to make something new, if you find a piece of work, then you're like, I don't even know how I would make this. That's the thing you should pick to make. Stretch yourself and figure out how you would make it. What tool would I do? Oh, I tried to make X part of it this way and it failed miserable. Oh, okay. Well, try something different then. Try a different way to make it. Try a different way to make it. I think that for me is like how you learn. It's easier to learn that way because you just it forces you way out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It forces you to, okay, you got to make that shoulder look like that shoulder because that's what's like the concept. And when you start diving down, you find the little nuances of shift change and plane changes that's in that, and you're like, oh man, how am I going to do this? So
it's important.
I say the same thing to my students. You should 100% be able to take a concept and remake it into 3D. And you're going to have that in many industries anyway. So you're going to have concept artists, maybe, in the field you go into that, hey, here's a concept, now you make it 3D. So.
Yeah, totally. Like it's a key part of it, right? It's a very key part of the industry as a whole is the pipeline of, you don't always get to be the person that makes the idea and executes the final sculpt, right? The final model. So being somebody who can have that translation skill is super, super important. And it teaches you, that's kind of what I was kind of getting at a little bit with this stuff with the Iron Man suits is if I had never tried, this was all, I didn't do the designs for these, right? So I was the modeler and the sculptor for these. So if I didn't know all this form stuff and all this color and detail stuff, and I wasn't able to sit with those guys, it would have been so difficult to make these models. So difficult because like I didn't have the understanding of all this stuff having to line up. If I didn't know that this should have lined up from the very beginning, right? And I was just making it myself, I might have never, the result would have never been this good because I wouldn't have seen that. I would have never learned that. So it's kind of, it's a challenge. Like giving yourself a challenge is something I think that I really recommend for sure.
I got to know what this is. This is got to be some kind of inside joke. I was told to ask you to get to the chopper. Get to the chopper.
That sounds very much like is Get to the Chopper. That's obviously Arnold. I'm trying to remember what movie it's from though.
Any movie, really, honestly. Here's a nice little fun quiz for you. There aren't that many action movies that Arnold Schwarzenegger has done that there's not at least a chopper scene in it. Almost all of them, there is a chopper scene in it.
Oh, okay.
Really, if you really go back and think about those movies, chopper.
It's from Predator.
Chopper.
There you go.
Running Man, chopper. True Lies, chopper. Predator, chopper. Honestly. Predator's got a chopper at the end. He's got to come. They come pick him up, and they take him. They drop him off. Come on, there's a chopper. End of Days even has a chopper scene in it. Like,
is it really? What about Twins?
Like the real quick. Kindergarten Cop's the only one that's the only one I can think off the top of my head where someone just chimed in Dougie. I don't think there's because he's a cop. There's no chopper scene in that one.
What about Twins?
I don't remember if they're doing
so.
No, you're right. I don't think there's one in
Jingle All the Way. I don't think
that's not an action movie. I did say an action movie. That's good. Good times.
For sure.
All right. I just want one last question too, because I know you got to get going.
Sure. Yeah.
With your day too. So for demo reels, especially working at Gnomon, what are you looking for in demo reels as like an art director, and then you obviously working now at a school, being a creative director there?
That's a really good question. There's a couple things. The number one piece of advice I actually give to everybody who's doing demo reels is it's kind of like a more theory based answer, but it's don't make me ask questions. Right. When I look at a demo reel, when I look at a reel, a portfolio site, whatever, I don't want your reel to make me ask questions. And what I mean by that is if you are applying for a character artist position, right? You apply for a character artist position and your portfolio has 2 characters, an environment, a prop, a weapon, it's got all this other stuff in it. You got 3 environments and 3 characters in your environment, in your portfolio, and you apply to me for a junior position. I'm going to wonder if you want to be an environment artist, or you want to be a character artist, right? Why are you showing me a portfolio, a character art portfolio with a bunch of not characters in it? That makes me ask a question, right? Just generally that topic of don't make me ask a question. Don't make me question your taste. If you have 5 pieces in your portfolio and 3 of them are great and 2 of them are not great, you're making me question, do you think that the 2 that are not very good are good? Did you get lucky on the 3? Like you happen to do good pieces on those 3 and the other 2 are like actually how good you are? Were you actually art directed very heavily? As soon as I start to see elements in a portfolio that make me question, and that can be the whole range, right? It can be a range of how big the portfolio is, how small the portfolio is. I recommend at least 3 pieces, less than 20, less than 10, right? Especially on, if you're showing me your art station, that's fine. If you've been working in the industry for 10 years and you got more than 10 pieces, okay, yeah, no Betamax, no VHS, no DVDs. Don't make me question your music choice, right? Like most of the time, I'm going to turn the music off anyways. Let's be honest. But
so do you find that even putting music on would probably be something better for a demo reel?
If you're going to do music, I think just choose something that's very background. Like I've opened up a couple portfolios and it's ranged from country music to hip hop to heavy speed metal, like to all different kinds of things. If it's insanely loud or frankly, if it's just not my taste, I'm going to turn it off right away. Like there's no reason for me to keep it on to begin with. So, and I might just close it. Like, okay, nope. You thought that putting this on your reel was a good idea, right? Because when you're applying for something, yeah, you're applying as you and your art, but the key part of it is also as you, right? The end point of hiring somebody is you're going to spend 40 to 60 hours or whatever a week with this person. So I'm in a way, yeah, I am looking at beyond just the images I see on screen. I want to know what makes you think. So if your portfolio site is poorly organized, that's a red flag for me. If I'm interested in your artwork and I search your social media and it gives me some red flags, yeah, that's a red flag for me. Like, so don't make somebody who's applying, right, or who you're applying to, don't make them ask any questions. It should be very straightforward. What you want somebody to do is within 10 seconds of looking at your reel or your portfolio, be like, yes, I know exactly what this person is wanting what position they're wanting. I know what their skill level is. I know that they're interested. I know that they generally have good taste, right? Like there's nothing that throws any red flags on the field for me. So that's kind of my big piece of advice. It's hard to boil it down into like just one, like, X amount of pieces or whatever. I think that stuff can all range, right? You can get a job with 1 piece in your portfolio. You can get a job with 60 pieces in your portfolio. You can put music on your reel. You can put, you can have bad graphic design. You can have whatever. There's going to be variations to the rule or exceptions to that. But it really kind of, to me, comes down to be very clear in your intent. Don't make the person ask questions when they're considering hiring you. And then the number one thing of which I put earlier is just always be nice. Be nice to everybody. If somebody doesn't you don't get the job, do not write them a mail. Do not send them a message about how you're upset. Right? That's a terrible idea. I've seen that before. I've gotten those.
You've done that. You've had that.
I've had people write me mails. I've had people send me messages afterwards saying how disappointed they are in me, or that they didn't get the position, or that they're, it's like,
it's a small industry.
Yeah, I even if I don't remember that name now, it may trigger later next time I see it. Right?
Now you know it.
Yeah, now I know it. So that's kind of my big pieces of advice, I guess.
So one last question. I think it's just a really good question, and just as an instructor too for yourself, I'm intrigued how would you handle this. So any advice to overcome the art block for beginners? So for example, this person just started sculpting and they're stuck on sculpting a face. And they feel like things missing and they can't get it quite right.
Sure. So it sounds like the question is kind of like just advice for building up fundamentals.
Just like, yeah, you're kind of stuck at a sculpt and you're like, okay, I've been working on this for hours and nothing's changing, nothing's getting better. What's your advice to overcome that? Like that artistic block, I guess, is what I would call it.
Two things.
I know what I do.
Right. A couple things that I do first. Like, let's say I'm working on this piece here, right? The first thing I'm going to do is working on this for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, however long. When I get up, like and let's say I'm planning to come back and work on this, is I will take screenshots of it like this, or I'll put a bunch of it on screen. I'll put it in Photoshop. I'll put it in whatever you want. Leave it in ZBrush. But the point of this is that I'll put it up so that when I come back and sit down, I'm looking at it. But I'm going to go get up first, and I'm going to go take an hour, 2, 3 hour, the night, whatever. When I come back, I want it to be the first thing that I'm looking at, and I want to sit down, not to be like, all right, I'm ready to continue. What I'm sitting down to do is I'm sitting down to be very critical, and I'm going to give myself notes as if I'm my boss, as if I'm something like, that I'm the art director here, right? So what do I not like about this? What should I fix in this? What doesn't look good to me? And then secondary to that, while you make this image, this screenshot, send it to 3 people that you trust, right? They don't necessarily even have to be artists. I've gotten great comments from all kinds of people who wouldn't consider themselves an artist or a sculptor or somebody who's talented in drawing, right? It's does this look good to you? Is there something that looks weird to you, right? So, often you'll see this sculpting a face, right? Oh, something in the face looks weird. Something in the neck looks weird. Something looks weird about this. So I send my stuff to friends and colleagues and family members all the time, right? So that's the 2 things I do. First is I evaluate myself, and then second, I send it off to other people to get their eyes, right? The whole fresh eyes kind of concept is kind of what we're really talking about there. And then the third thing is work on something else. So if you're really stuck on it and there's no deadline for it, work on something else for a while, right? Work on something else, work on something similar, work on something completely different. And then eventually when you come back with that critical eye. You might already have it, right? Especially when you're a beginner or you're starting out, there's sort of that exponential growth that you have for the first several, years, essentially, while you're working on a new skill. And that's very common to see is at a certain point, let's say you're a student right now and you're in your 2nd term of school. The skills that you have by your 4th term are probably going to be 3, 4, 5, 6 times better than you have right now, just because you're learning so much right now. And so coming back to a project after a quarter, coming back to a project after 2 quarters, you're going to come back and you're going to sit down and be like, oh, this needs a lot of work, and you're going to know what you need to fix, right? So sometimes just giving it a little bit of a break is really, really valuable. I have folders and folders and folders of projects that I've never finished, right? Some characters that I've never finished, some characters that I've attempted multiple times because I've started them, and then I've gotten to a point where I'm like, you know what? I'm not able to see where this is going. I'm not able to push this far enough for me, right? This isn't my mentality or my skill level right now can't make this character yet, right? I'll come back to it later. And I think that's a very, that's the way I kind of approach things, is just like, give yourself some distance, be critical, and get some other fresh eyes. So.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's time to call this a done stream.
Sure.
I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend with us and answer the questions from people and sharing your workflows that you've been doing, especially all the stuff you talked about with all the Iron Man stuff that you worked on as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to let everybody know as well, these are ZBrush Master courses. So we were just with Josh Herman. Next week's going to be Steve Lord, which is already going to be September 1st. Oh my God, it's September already. So again, Josh is kicking off season 4 for us. So we got Josh Herman, then Steve Lord, then Jose Diba, and then Rafael Grassetti and Maria Pampalova and season 4. So amazing lineup. So please come back next Tuesday as well to check out Steve Lord's stream with us. Josh, I want to leave the last word for you. Again, I thank you for being a part of this. I don't know if there's anything you would like to add and end with before we end the stream.
No, I really appreciate you guys being here, or everybody who's come. That's awesome. Yeah, I like showing this kind of stuff off, so I'm super excited to see the rest of you guys' Master Series. I think you guys have a killer lineup, so I'm excited to watch the rest of them. And then if you guys are ever interested in the projects that I'm working on, I'm on the Gnomon stream as well. So that's on Wednesdays from 10 to 1. So feel free to check that out if you're interested.
Yeah, which is on Twitch. You guys are only on Twitch, right?
We're having some technical issues, but we're mostly on Twitch. Yes.
Okay. So again, that's every Wednesday, 10 to 1.
Yes, Pacific
on the Twitch channel. Josh is up there and doing some more work, so you can ask him more questions as well there.
Sweet.
And do you have any other like personal spots, like websites?
I have my, you can kind of see them up here.
Yeah.
My Instagram is up here, and my ArtStation is up here. I also have a Twitch channel, which is at the same tag. It's all the same. Droids for sale all across everything. So twitch.com/ or whatever TV, droids for sale.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again. Thanks everybody too for joining us. I really appreciate that. And hopefully we see you all next week. And Josh, thank you again, man. That was great. And especially all the little stuff you shared about the Iron Man too. I think it was a great eye opener for people to see that flow that's actually happening throughout the suits. So,
it takes a while to learn it. So
yeah,
I'm happy. Hopefully somebody else can learn it quicker than I did.
Well, you did what, 20 something you said of them? So
13, yeah.
Yeah. You got it you got the belt, the Iron Man belt. You got it. All right. So thank you again, everybody. Really appreciate you being a part of our stream. We're going to sign off now. Have a wonderful evening for those around the world. Afternoon, if you're in North America area. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you online for other streams. I myself will be streaming again on the Pixologic this Friday at 11 a.m. as well. So if you want to come back and ask me more questions, feel free to do that as well. Okay. So bye, everybody.